A family divided. I always believed that blood was supposed to protect you, not prey on you. But when a legacy becomes a prize, family can turn into competitors, even enemies. The farm wasn't just land. It was the place where our history was plowed into the soil. Every fence, every barn board, every tractor tire mark told the story of generations who worked before us. My grandfather called it a living memory, and he trusted my father to carry that memory forward. But after Dad passed, trust in our family shattered into pieces, sharp enough to cut. My mother always said grief changes people, but I never expected it to twist my own relatives into strangers. It started subtly, little questions, hints that maybe the farm should be managed differently. At first, I thought they cared. I thought they wanted to help us recover. But greed never walks in shouting. It sneaks in wearing concern like a mask. My uncles were the ringleaders. Uncle Terry, with his pressed shirts and slick smile, saw the farm as a ticket to power. Uncle Rick, who always complained about being the forgotten brother, saw dollar signs instead of hay bales. And then there was my cousin Brian, the loudmouth who'd never worked a day in his life yet, acted like he knew everything about everything. They started circling us like vultures, waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in and take what they felt was theirs. Mom didn't trust them, neither did I, but we were tired, overwhelmed, and still recovering from the loss that had hollowed out our hearts. They leveraged that weakness, arriving with paperwork and promises. "Just sign here," they'd say. "It'll simplify everything." I was young but not stupid. I refused every time, and every time, their smiles cracked a little more. They pressured us constantly. Terry showed up with real estate agents pretending to evaluate the property. Rick brought lawyers, who claimed they were simply trying to help us avoid legal complications. Brian called me selfish, accusing me of clinging to a memory that was dragging the family down. Their words were poison, dripping with manipulation. Then came the breaking point. My mother fell ill. Stress, the doctor said. Too much pressure, too much grief, too much fighting. As she lay in the hospital bed, pale and exhausted, Terry made his move. "We'll handle the farm paperwork until she gets better," he insisted. "It's temporary." Lies. All lies. They cornered me outside the hospital one chilly morning, papers in hand, the smell of cheap coffee and cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Terry put a pen in my hand. Rick blocked my way. Brian whispered that if I didn't sign, they'd find another way to get what they wanted, no matter the cost. I saw the threat in his eyes. I froze. Fear crawled into my throat, making it hard to breathe. I knew signing would betray everything Dad fought to protect. I felt helpless, until a memory hit me like a bolt of lightning. Dad's voice, firm and steady. "Never sign anything you don't understand, and never let wolves touch this land." My pulse steadied. I forced a nod and pretended to give in. They smirked like they'd already won. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. As they watched closely, making sure I didn't accidentally read too much, I pretended to sign. The pen glided, leaving marks that looked like my signature, but it wasn't my real one. Dad had taught me a trick when I was little, how to replicate my name dozens of ways while only one version was truly mine. He called it protecting what matters. That fake signature was the first time I truly understood the power of that lesson. "Good choice," Terry said, relief dripping from his voice. They gathered the papers like predators securing their kill and rushed off, probably planning how they'd divide the spoils. I stood there shaking, not from fear anymore, but from rage. I made a silent promise. They would regret ever trying to take what wasn't theirs. Days later, everything exploded. Their lawyer tried to register the transfer, confident they'd fooled me. But the county clerk wasn't so easily fooled. My fake signature didn't match the legal one on file. Dad had required official documentation years ago for anything involving the farm, fingerprints included. The clerk flagged the attempt and triggered a fraud investigation automatically. Suddenly, the wolves were caught in their own trap. When the police arrived at Terry's office, he protested loudly, accusing me of sabotaging him. Rick tried to blame everyone else, and Brian nearly cried, insisting he didn't know. But the law didn't care about their excuses. The evidence was clear: attempted property theft, coercion, and document fraud. Their downfall came in the exact moment they fired up their greed. The news traveled fast in our small town. People who once respected my uncles now crossed the street to avoid them. Their businesses suffered. Their reputations crumbled. And for the first time, they looked smaller, weaker, and less dangerous than I had ever seen them. Mom recovered slowly, and when I told her what happened, tears filled her eyes, not from pain this time, but from pride. "Your father would be so proud of you," she whispered, squeezing my hand. And for the first time since Dad's death, I believed it. But even as justice found them, they didn't accept defeat. Their anger simmered. Their stares burned holes through us every time we passed them in town. I knew the story wasn't over. Greed doesn't give up easily. It evolves, looking for cracks, planning another strike. Still, I had gained something powerful that day, the knowledge that I could defend what mattered. I wasn't just the grieving daughter anymore. I was the last line of defense for our family's legacy. The battleground wasn't just soil and crops. It was truth versus deception, loyalty versus betrayal. And I wasn't done fighting. I thought their arrest and humiliation would be the end of it. I thought the truth would act like a shield, keeping my uncles and cousin away from us forever. But greed doesn't die from one blow. It waits, it heals, and it returns more vicious than before. They were furious at being exposed, angrier still that a kid outsmarted them. And instead of learning a lesson, they decided to teach me one. It started with the little things. Machinery we had just repaired suddenly stopped working. The barn door mysteriously fell off its hinges. Fences, sturdy for years, began collapsing in the middle of the night. At first, I believed it was just bad luck or age catching up with the farm. But bad luck doesn't leave footprints or cigarette butts behind. One morning, I found tire tracks leading from the road directly into the cornfield, flattening rows we needed to harvest. I stared at the destruction, fury bubbling in my veins. I knew exactly who did it. Only someone who wanted to hurt us financially and emotionally would target the crops. Mom begged me not to confront them directly. "They're looking for a reaction," she warned. "If you give them one, they'll only escalate." She was right, but the anger inside me wasn't something that cooled easily. Dad had poured his soul into this land, and watching them destroy it felt like watching someone spit on his grave. And then, somehow, they got smarter. Instead of physical sabotage, they shifted to something worse: rumors. Terry was a charming liar, always had been. He started telling people in town that I committed fraud, that I forged the signature to cheat them out of the farm, that I was unstable, grieving, and trying to punish the family for things that weren't real. Some people knew better. Others, especially those who already envied our land, swallowed his words whole. The invitations to neighborhood barbecues stopped. Conversations turned cold. Eyes followed me everywhere, filled with suspicion instead of sympathy. It hurt more than I expected. A community that once embraced us now doubted us. But I refused to let their whispers turn into chains. One evening, while repairing the fence near the boundary line, I heard voices. Terry and Rick stood on their side, speaking as if they wanted me to overhear. "She thinks she's won," Terry sneered. "But we're just getting started." Rick chuckled darkly. "Let her rebuild. The higher she climbs, the harder she'll fall." I kept hammering, pretending I didn't hear. But inside, every word etched itself into resolve. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one they'd never forget. Then came the worst blow yet. Mom's illness wasn't gone, just hiding. The stress of constant conflict brought it back, stronger this time. She collapsed in the kitchen, and I rushed her to the hospital, heart pounding like a panicked drum. The doctor said she needed rest, peace, and most importantly, security. Stress could be deadly. That night, sitting alone by our hospital bed, I made a promise to myself, and to Dad's memory. I would protect this farm. No matter what it took, I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I was the rightful heir to this legacy, and I wouldn't let snakes slither through our soil. When I returned home, a new kind of determination followed me through the front door. I began reading through every legal document my father had ever signed. Deeds, agreements, business plans. That's when I found something. A letter addressed to me, sealed and tucked inside the safe. My hands trembled as I opened it. Dad's handwriting greeted me like a warm embrace. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to defend what we built. This land isn't just ours. It belongs to those who honor it. If anyone ever tries to steal it, remember, knowledge is your strongest weapon. Inside the envelope was also a copy of a contract I had never seen, a clause stating that only a direct blood heir who had physically worked the land for at least 5 years could ever claim ownership. Terry and Rick had avoided manual labor their entire lives. The farm disqualified them by default. Brian? He had never so much as shoveled manure. They could never legally take the farm, not even through manipulation. They were doomed, and they didn't know it. Armed with that knowledge, my fear dissolved. I finally understood why Dad had taught me multiple signatures, why he kept documents hidden. He had seen this battle coming long before I did. The next day, I walked into town with my head held high. When people whispered, I smiled. Their words no longer pierced me. I went straight into the county office and filed a formal protective claim over the farm, sealing the ownership even tighter. The clerk nodded respectfully, as if he had been waiting for me to take this step. That evening, Terry showed up. He barged into the driveway, rage twisting his face into something monstrous. Rick and Brian stood behind him, arms crossed, thinking their presence was intimidating. But I didn't flinch. "You think you're clever?" Terry spat. "You think this is over?" "I know it's over," I replied calmly. "Legally, you lost the moment Dad made the rules. You should have spent less time scheming and more time working." Brian cursed and took a threatening step forward, but Rick held him back. Terry's eyes burned into mine, but for the first time, I saw fear flicker beneath the rage. "You'll regret this," he growled, voice trembling. "No," I said, stepping closer. "You'll regret underestimating me." They left, tires screeching as they sped away. I stood in the settling dust, chest rising with every victorious breath. But victory always has a price. And deep inside, I knew they wouldn't give up that easily. When greed loses, it doesn't retreat. It becomes desperate. And desperate men are dangerous. The farm had always felt like a shield, our sanctuary from the world's chaos. But now, it felt like a battleground. Every creak in the barn, every rustle of wind through the cornstalks, made me wonder if the danger was hiding nearby, watching. My uncles had been defeated legally, but their anger was growing wild, untamed, and unpredictable. I spent every morning scanning the land before starting work. Fresh tire tracks appeared where none should have been. Tools disappeared. One night, the livestock panicked without reason. I found the gate wide open. Someone wanted them to run, to get lost or injured. The more desperate Terry and Rick became, the more spiteful their actions turned. Still, I refused to be frightened into retreating. I worked harder, pushed myself to keep things running smoothly while Mom recovered. It wasn't easy. Running a farm alone feels like wrestling a storm with bare hands. But determination can be stronger than muscle, and I had plenty of that. One afternoon, while clearing out the old tool shed, I discovered something strange. A wooden floorboard had shifted loose. At first, I thought it was just rot or age, but when I lifted it, I found a hidden metal box covered in dust. My heart raced. Dad had always been secretive about certain things, especially anything to do with protecting the farm. Inside the box were labeled folders, documents stamped with legal seals, and a stack of photographs. The first picture made my stomach twist. It was a younger version of Terry and Rick standing beside my father, each holding a piece of equipment actually working. I thought they never lifted a finger for the farm, but these photos suggested otherwise. Flipping through, I noticed something odd. In every picture, they looked irritated, angry, forced. Dad wasn't smiling either. Not his real smile. It was the smile he wore when dealing with something he hated but had no choice about. Something wasn't adding up. Then I found another document, one that changed everything I thought I knew. It was a settlement agreement. Apparently, years ago, Terry and Rick threatened to sue Dad over unequal inheritance expectations. In simpler words, they wanted the farm even when Dad was alive. The document showed that Dad let them assist with operations temporarily, but the clause was clear. None of their work counted toward ownership qualification. They weren't just greedy now. They had always been this way. My fingers tightened around the paper. How could people be so obsessed with something they didn't even care about? They didn't love this land. They only loved what it could buy. I set the documents aside and continued rummaging. At the bottom of the box was a cassette tape labeled, "If They Come Back." My heartbeat quickened. I found Dad's old tape player in the corner and shoved the tape in. The machine clicked. Word. Then his voice filled the small space. "If you're hearing this, they didn't change. I hope they would, but greed has a way of digging into a man's heart until nothing else grows." Hearing his voice again was like being punched in the chest and hugged at the same time. They're after the farm because they lost their own chances. Rick gambled away his money. Terry's businesses fail because he lies and cheats. And Brian? Well, he's just following the wrong people. They blame me for what they ruined themselves. A pause. A breath. Emotion I could hear but not see. This farm stays in your hands. I trust you, kid. Be smarter than them. They think you're weak because you care, but caring is your strength. The tape ended, leaving silence that echoed louder than any words. I wiped tears from my cheeks before they could fall. Dad wasn't just protecting the farm from them. He was preparing me for this exact war. With newfound knowledge and a heart burning hotter than ever, I made a plan. If they wanted a fight, I'd end it once and for all. That night, I installed cameras around the property. Motion sensors, new locks, bright floodlights that snapped on at the slightest movement. If they tried one more stunt, I'd have proof. And proof had already crushed them once. But while I prepared for their attack, something unexpected happened. The sheriff came to visit. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking uneasy. "We got a report," he said. "Your uncles claim you threatened them." I nearly laughed. "Threatened them? They're the ones sabotaging the farm." "I believe you," he assured quickly. "But the thing about the law is, it needs evidence. Keep your guard up." Evidence? That was exactly what I was working on. Just as the sheriff left, I noticed a black truck parked far down the road. Engine off, lights out, watching. Even from that distance, I could feel Terry's stare cutting through the dark. I didn't call the police. I didn't hide. Instead, I walked to the middle of the driveway and stared back. My message was clear. I'm not scared anymore. The truck hesitated, then finally drove off. But it wasn't retreat. It was reconnaissance. They were planning something bigger, something colder. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house put my nerves on edge. At sunrise, as exhaustion pulled at my bones, I stepped outside to check the barn. My breath caught in my throat. Spray painted across the wooden door, in bold, dripping letters, were the words, "This isn't over." The sight of it ignited a fury inside me that no fear could smother. They wanted to intimidate me, weaken me, shake my resolve, but they only fueled the fire. I ran my fingertips over the wet paint and whispered, "You're right. It isn't over." Because what they didn't know yet, what they could never imagine, was that I wasn't just defending the farm anymore. I was preparing to destroy them. I knew the graffiti on the barn door was just the opening strike. My uncles didn't do warnings unless something bigger was already brewing beneath the surface. And this time, their desperation would push them past the point of stupidity and into the territory of self-destruction. That afternoon, I scrubbed the barn clean, each stroke of the brush scrubbing away the fear they tried to plant. They thought intimidation was a weapon, but I'd learned something about intimidation. It only works on the fearful. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry, and anger with a purpose is unbeatable. As I worked, an idea started to form. A dangerous idea. One Dad himself would have approved of. They wanted proof that I wasn't fit to run the farm? Fine. I would give them proof, but not the kind they expected. The cameras were in place, the sensors active, the legal protections locked tight. What I needed now was a situation that would force them to expose themselves fully. Breaking tools and vandalizing barns were small crimes, ones they could wiggle out of. But I wanted them caught doing something unforgivable, undeniable, something that would remove them from our lives for good. I waited. Patience is a farmer's greatest strength. We wait for the rain. We wait for the harvest. And now, I waited for their downfall. It didn't take long. 3 nights later, long after the sun fell and Mom was asleep, I saw the first sign. The motion sensor light near the truck blinked on. Then, another, and another. They were moving toward the barn. I grabbed the phone and quietly positioned myself inside the house, watching the camera feed. Terry led the way, a crowbar in hand. Rick carried a red gas can. Brian followed nervously, glancing over his shoulder like a coward who knew he was in too deep. My breath caught. Gasoline? They weren't here to sabotage. They were here to burn the farm down. My fists clenched, adrenaline rushing through my veins like wildfire. The barn wasn't just wood and nails. It held Dad's tractors, our livestock, equipment we depended on. It held memories. And these men, these cowards, wanted to turn all of it to ash because they couldn't own it. They whispered among themselves, but the microphones picked up everything. "Light it fast," Terry hissed. "She needs to lose everything." "That's too far," Brian muttered. "We'll go to prison." "You're already in it," Rick growled. "There's no backing out." That was my moment. Not rage, not confrontation, evidence. I stepped outside and flicked on every floodlight on the property. The land glowed white like daylight. The 3 of them froze, deer caught by judgment instead of headlights. Terry turned slowly, and when his eyes found me, I saw a crack of fear slice his confidence in half. "You really thought you'd get away with this?" I said, voice steady as steel. Rick dropped the gas can. Brian stepped back like the ground itself rejected him. "You're making a mistake," Terry snarled, trying to regain control. "No," I said, raising my voice as I held up my phone. "You did. The entire county is hearing this right now." I had already hit speed dial the moment I saw the gas can. Sirens wailed in the distance, an approaching storm they couldn't outrun. Rick cursed and tried to escape. Brian fell to his knees. Terry, as arrogant as ever, stepped toward me, crowbar raised slightly. "You don't know what you're doing," he growled. "Oh, I do," I replied. "You made me stronger." The sheriff's cars skidded into the driveway, lights flashing like divine justice cutting through the night. Officers swarmed them before they had a chance to move again. Terry fought, screaming that I forged the signature, that I manipulated everything, that he was the victim. Rick buried his face against the patrol car hood, sobbing curses. Brian didn't resist. He just stared at me with the eyes of someone who finally saw the monster he had chosen to follow. I watched them get cuffed, watched their power drained from their bodies like poison drained from a wound. One officer walked over to me. "You all right?" "I am now," I said, voice calm, as if I'd waited my whole life for this moment. Another officer approached Terry and read him his charges: arson attempt, property destruction, trespassing while under investigation, and a new one: conspiracy to commit fraud with intent to harm. Serious crimes. Crimes that reeked of desperation. Justice wasn't just knocking, it kicked down the door. Before they shoved Terry into the police car, he turned his head just enough for me to hear his final words. "This isn't the end." I stepped closer, matching his glare with a calm that came from victory. "Yes, Terry," I whispered. "It is." The doors slammed shut. The engines revved. The taillights disappeared into the night, taking decades of manipulation and hatred with them. For the first time in months, maybe years, silence felt safe. The sheriff assured me the farm was secure and promised increased patrols. Mom, waking later and hearing what happened, cried into my shoulder. "Your father raised a fighter," she whispered. I held her tight, knowing she was right. The next morning, as dawn painted the fields in warm gold, I walked the farm alone. The wind rustled through the crops, almost like Dad was speaking through the land itself. "You did it," I whispered. "You were right. Caring is strength." But as I admired the peaceful silence, something new flickered in the back of my mind. Not fear, but caution. They were gone. They were arrested. They were exposed. Yet Terry's final words repeated like a haunting echo. This isn't the end. And deep down, I knew men like them don't let go. They don't reform. They don't disappear quietly. So I vowed something to the land and to myself. If they ever return, I'll be ready. Peace returned. But it wasn't the kind of peace that makes you rest. It was the kind that makes you listen harder, watch closer, breathe cautiously, as if the world is simply taking a break before the next storm. Mom and I tried to settle back into our rhythm. The police reports, the hearings, the endless questions, they all faded slowly, like the last echoes of thunder after a long night of lightning. But I knew better than to believe the storm was truly over. 3 weeks passed before the next disruption. It was Sunday morning. The sun was just rising, casting those soft pink streaks across the field that always made me feel like Dad was still here. I was feeding the chickens when a car rolled to a slow stop in front of the house. A sleek black sedan, nothing like the pickup trucks usually seen around here. A tall man with sharp eyes stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket like someone who never had to worry about dirt ruining anything he owned. "Good morning," he called out, walking toward me with a polished smile. "You must be her." I didn't return the smile. "Who are you?" He stopped a respectful distance away. "My name is Daniel Graves. I'm an attorney. I represent—" He paused, studying my face. "Your family." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Which ones?" "The ones currently facing significant criminal charges." "Of course. Terry and Rick wouldn't dare give up control of their schemes, not even behind bars. I have nothing to say to you." His smile didn't fade. "You might want to hear this. There's a new development." I crossed my arms, holding my ground. "Say it." He took out a folder. "Your uncles insist that they were acting under the belief that they owned a portion of this farm. They are preparing a civil suit claiming your name on the deed is fraudulent, and—" I cut him off. "They already tried this, and they failed." "Yes," he replied calmly, "but desperation breeds creativity." I stared him down. "Leave." He tilted his head slightly, still composed. "One last thing. They asked me to give you a message." He paused, letting suspense wrap around his words. They said, "Family never quits." I felt my jaw clench. That wasn't a message. It was a threat dressed as loyalty. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. When the engine faded down the road, I breathed out slowly, letting anger cool into caution. They were still trying to claw their way back into our lives. Even jail couldn't contain their greed. But this time, they miscalculated. This wasn't the old me they were dealing with. Not the devastated daughter. Not the trembling niece. I had become someone new. Sharper, steadier, unbreakable. And I wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, the community began shifting again. The truth about the arson attempt spread, and many who once doubted now offered support. Favors arrived in the form of strong hands and borrowed tools. A neighbor helped rebuild the barn door. Another reinforced the livestock pen. They weren't just repairing wood and metal. They were restoring my faith in people. One afternoon, as we hammered in the last nail on the new barn gate, Mr. Stevens, our closest neighbor, leaned on his cane and looked at me thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "your father always said you'd be the one to save this place. Said you had more fight in you than a pack of wolves." I smiled, warmth blooming in my chest. "Dad believed in the farm more than anything." "He believed in you more," he corrected. That night, I sat under the stars, thinking about Dad's voice on the tape, about the legacy in the soil beneath me, and about the enemies who had once been family. I began to understand something important. The real inheritance wasn't the land. It was the courage to defend it. The next day, the phone rang. It was the sheriff. His tone carried a quiet satisfaction. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "Your uncles withdrew their lawsuit. Their lawyer walked away from the case. Claims they were uncooperative." I almost laughed. The trap I had set with the evidence, the legal protections, the community support, it had tightened around them so hard they couldn't breathe. "And Brian?" I asked. "He confessed everything," the sheriff replied. "Testified against them. He's packing up and leaving town." For a moment, I felt sadness. Brian was foolish, but he wasn't evil, just too weak to resist the poison of Terry and Rick. Maybe leaving was the only way he'd ever find a different path. The sheriff then added something I didn't expect. Your father would be proud. After the call ended, I stepped outside and let the wind wash over me. It smelled like hay and soil and possibility. It was done. Not just legally, not just physically. The grip they once had on us, on me, was broken, shattered, gone. I walked to the field, letting my hand brush the tops of the young crops, gently swaying in the breeze. Every plant felt like a heartbeat, every row like a story continuing. The sun warmed my skin. The earth felt steady beneath my boots. This is ours, I whispered. Forever. Mom joined me, leaning against my shoulder. She looked healthier, happier, lighter than she'd been in years. They won't come back, she said softly. No, I agreed. Because they know, if they do, they'll lose more than a lawsuit. She smiled, proud tears shimmering in her eyes. You saved the farm. You saved our future. I protected what Dad trusted me with, I replied. That's all I ever wanted. From that moment on, the farm wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. The crops grew strong, the animals flourished, and the land, our land, felt alive again. Sometimes at dusk, I stand at the top of the hill where Dad used to watch the sunset. I imagine him there, arms folded, a small approving grin on his face. I imagine him saying, I knew you could do it, kid. There are scars left behind, trust broken, innocence lost. But those scars remind me of who I became. Not a victim, not just a farmer, a guardian. They pressured me to sign over the farm. They thought fear would make me surrender. They believed greed would grant them victory. But my fake signature sealed their fate. Because it wasn't just ink on paper. It was a promise, a warning, a declaration. This legacy will never fall into the wrong hands again.